The galactic armada hovered on the edges of the Sol system, an endless sea of warships blotting out the stars. Hundreds of worlds had fallen to them, entire civilizations crushed beneath their advance. Now it was Earth's turn. The high command of the invaders had expected immediate surrender. After all, no species had ever survived an encounter with their fleet. Their technology was superior, their numbers were overwhelming, their weapons could reduce planets to molten rock in hours. Yet when their ultimatum was sent, humanity's response was not surrender. It was a single ship, one ship, not a fleet, not an armada of its own, just one vessel barely the size of a destroyer, painted in deep black with no insignias, no markings. It drifted out from Earth's orbit, heading straight for the enemy's lines in the command center of the invasion force. Supreme Commander Kale of the Dominion watched the feed with disbelief. He turned to his second in command, a reptilian officer with jagged plates running down his spine. "Are they mocking us?" Thalon growled. His officer hesitated. It appears so, Supreme Commander. No species has ever responded like this before." The crew on the bridge remained silent, each of them exchanging uneasy glances. They had raised empires, crushed resistance fleets that numbered in the thousands, yet this was something they had never seen before. Kale slammed his fist against the console. "Fools, they think one ship can stand against us," he sneered, baring his fangs. "Prepare the fleet. I want that vessel destroyed. Send a message to their leaders. Let them know this insult will cost them dearly." At that moment, the mysterious human ship hailed them. A holographic projection flickered to life on the command deck, revealing a human officer clad in a dark uniform. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes sharp and cold. "This is Captain Lyra Vance of the UHS Wraith," she said, her voice calm, almost casual. "I'm here to negotiate your surrender." Laughter erupted across the command deck. Officers sneered, some outright doubled over with amusement. Surrender. The idea was ludicrous. Kale leaned forward, his massive form casting a shadow over the projection. "You dare speak to me of surrender, human? You face the might of the Dominion. We have reduced entire civilizations to ashes. Your planet will burn like all the rest." Captain Vance didn't blink, her voice remained steady. "You misunderstand, Commander. I'm not asking for our surrender, I'm offering you yours." The laughter died instantly. Silence deep and thick settled over the bridge. Kale's eyes narrowed. He had faced enemies who bluffed before, who made bold declarations in the face of doom. This felt different. "You are either the bravest or the most foolish creature I have ever encountered," Kale said. "Tell me, Captain, what makes you think you stand a chance against us?" Vance leaned slightly forward, and for the first time a faint smile touched her lips. "Because you don't understand what this ship is." Without another word, the transmission cut off. Kale roared in fury. "Fire! Destroy that ship!" The command was given, and 100 Dominion warships opened fire. Beams of raw energy missiles and kinetic projectiles streaked toward the lone vessel, a barrage that could wipe out an entire fleet. Then something impossible happened. The Wraith didn't evade, it didn't even attempt to raise shields. Instead, it simply moved just a fraction of an inch before vanishing entirely. Not cloaking, not teleportation, it was as if reality itself had folded around it. The incoming fire passed harmlessly through empty space where the ship had been before anyone could react. The Wraith reappeared behind the lead warship of the Dominion's vanguard. A single shot was fired, a small pulse of violet energy. The Dominion warship, a vessel 5 times its size, didn't explode, it didn't even burn, it simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, then it was gone. No debris, no wreckage, just nothing. The bridge of the Dominion's command ship erupted into chaos. Officers shouted, scanning their sensors, trying to understand what had happened. It wasn't destroyed," one of the tactical officers stammered. "It was erased." Kale felt a chill crawl up his spine. He turned to his second in command. "How is this possible?" No answer came across the battlefield. The Wraith moved again. Every shot fired at it missed, not because it dodged, but because it seemed to exist just outside of reality itself, and with every move it erased another ship one by one. Entire battleships disappeared without a trace. It was not fighting, it was not even war, it was extermination. Kale clenched his fists. "But what have we awakened?" Then another transmission came through. Captain Vance's face appeared once more, the faintest trace of amusement in her gaze. "I'll give you one last chance," Vance said. "Surrender." Kale's throat went dry. Never in all his campaigns had he encountered something like this. Never had he felt what he felt now, fear. His species had believed themselves The apex predators of the galaxy, unstoppable, invincible, and yet in the span of minutes one human ship had rewritten everything. The Dominion had sent thousands of warships expecting an easy victory. Humanity had sent just one, and it was more than enough. The Wraith hovered in the void, silent and unmoving, as if daring the Dominion fleet to make another move, but no one fired, no one even spoke. Fear had settled over the enemy command deck like a suffocating fog. Kale clenched his fists, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him to order a full retreat, and yet he knew what that would mean. The Dominion had never retreated before. Surrender was unthinkable. To go back to admit that they had been bested by a single human ship would destroy their reputation. His people would demand an explanation. His superiors would see it as weakness. They would strip him of his rank, if not worse. But what choice did he have? Another Dominion ship, vanished from existence, erased with the same eerie precision as before. The Wraith hadn't moved, it hadn't fired visible weapons, it simply decided that the ship no longer existed. Kale's officers looked at him now, their gazes filled with something he had never seen before. Pleading, they wanted him to call for retreat, they wanted him to save them. Captain Vance's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I'll ask one last time, Commander." Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Surrender." Kale's throat tightened. His entire career, his entire life had been built on the belief that the Dominion was superior to all others. They had conquered 100 worlds, they had crushed civilizations beneath their heel, and yet here they were brought to their knees by a single ship, a warship unlike anything they had ever seen. He forced himself to speak. We do not surrender," Vance sighed. "Then you leave me no choice." The screen cut out, then the Wraith moved. If what it had done before was terrifying, what happened next was incomprehensible. The ship flickered. One moment it was in front of them, the next it was behind them, then above, then below. It didn't move like any ship should. It didn't obey physics, didn't play by the rules of space. It existed where it wanted, when it wanted. A Dominion battle cruiser, one of their most powerful ships, fired a desperate barrage. The moment the weapons were discharged, the Wraith split, not into two ships, not into three, into thousands, each copy identical, each one perfect. Sensors couldn't tell which was real, which was fake, if any of them were fake at all. Kale's hands trembled as the wave of wraiths swarmed his fleet, encircling them in every direction. The Dominion ships opened fire in blind panic, but it was useless. The shots passed through some of the ships as if they weren't even there, while others vanished only to reappear somewhere else entirely. The real attack began. Kale watched in horror as entire capital ships collapsed into themselves, crushed as if by an invisible force. Other ships blinked out of existence, their crews screaming over the comms before they were snuffed out. One ship was twisted, not destroyed, not erased, but warped into a shape that was no longer recognizable. The hull crumpled like paper, metal and flesh fused together, the screams of the crew distorting into an unnatural gurgling wail before the wreck drifted away lifeless. This was not war, this was annihilation. The Wraith was toying with them. It could have ended them in an instant, but it wanted them to understand, to fear. Kale's mind broke, his pride, his belief in Dominion's superiority. It was all gone. There was no hope, no escape. "Stop," he gasped. "Please stop." The Wraith halted. All of the copies, all of the flickering impossibilities vanished in an instant, leaving only the one original ship. Another transmission opened. Captain Vance stared at him, expression unreadable. "You're ready to talk now," she said. It wasn't a question. Kale swallowed hard. "But what is this ship?" Vance leaned back slightly. "A message." Kale shook his head. "No ship can do this, no technology can do this." Vance gave a small knowing smile. "That's because it isn't just technology." The word sent a chill through Kale's bones. He had assumed that the Wraith was simply an advanced warship, something beyond their understanding. But what if it was more? What if it wasn't just a weapon but a warning? "What do you want, Kale?" whispered. Vance's smile faded. "We want you to understand." "Understand what?" The human captain leaned forward. When she spoke, there was something different in her voice, something ancient. "You thought you were the apex predators of this galaxy," Vance said, "but you never truly met us." Kale's breathing grew shallow. Vance continued. "Every species you conquered, every world you burned, they weren't like us, they were prey. You never fought an actual predator before." A pause. "You have now." Kale felt the weight of those words settle over him. Vance gestured at the wreckage of his once mighty fleet. "You came to take our world, to burn it, to crush it like all the others. You thought you knew what we were." The Wraith's engines flared, and for the first time a glimpse of something vast and incomprehensible seemed to pulse beneath its hull. Vance's next words were barely above a whisper. "You have no idea." The transmission cut. Cale's body sagged in his chair. He had spent his entire life believing in the might of the Dominion and their unchallenged supremacy. Now all of that was gone because the truth was undeniable. Humanity had sent one ship, and it was more than enough. Silence stretched across the Dominion fleet, a silence thick with fear and disbelief. The Wraith hung motionless in space, as if waiting, watching. It had torn through their ships like a god plucking wings from insects, yet it had stopped not out of mercy, Cale realized, but out of something far worse. It wanted them to learn his mind. Reeled his fleet, once the pride of the Dominion, had been reduced to scraps, their numbers dwindling with every breath. Every attempt at retaliation had been meaningless. Every maneuver had been countered before it had even begun. The Wraith did not fight as any warship should, because it was not a warship, not in the way Cale understood. It was something else. Supreme Commander. One of his officers whispered, her voice barely audible. But what do we do? He had no answer. Then the Wraith moved again. It wasn't an attack. There was no weapon discharge, no visible energy signature, yet one of their remaining dreadnoughts simply collapsed. One moment it was there, a towering behemoth of steel and firepower. The next it was smaller, shrinking, its hull imploded, its structure twisting in on itself, as though an invisible hand had crushed it to a fraction of its former size. The Dominion officers aboard screamed, their voices cutting off, as the ship condensed into a single blackened sphere no larger than a fightercraft. Then it was gone, not destroyed, not even erased, reduced. Cale felt cold horror settle into his bones. He had seen countless weapons, witnessed the power of planetary bombardments, the fury of antimatter warheads, but this was something that should not exist. This isn't war, he muttered. Vance's voice returned sharp and steady. No, it's not. Cale turned, his hands curling into fists. Then what is it? he demanded. Vance leaned forward, her expression unreadable. This is what happens when you mistake patience for weakness. The words struck deep. For centuries the Dominion had expanded unchecked. They had crushed world after world, silencing every resistance before it could become a threat. They had seen themselves as conquerors, the natural rulers of the stars, and humanity had waited, watched, allowed them to think Earth was just another target. Vance's expression darkened. You never asked why we never expanded, why we never reached for the stars like the others you crushed. Cale had never considered the question. He had assumed, like the rest of the Dominion, that humanity was simply behind in development. Now that assumption was unraveling before his eyes. We never expanded, Vance said, because we didn't need to. The Wraith pulsed. A deep, unnatural hum filled the calms, not a sound but a presence, something that dug into the bones and settled behind the eyes, a feeling of something vast, something old. Vance's voice was quiet, almost gentle. Do you know what happens when a species is forced to survive generation after generation without mercy, without a safety net, when every predator, every force of nature, every cruel twist of fate exists to kill them? Cale swallowed. Vance's eyes burned cold. They become something else. The Wraith rippled. Cale's sensors flared with warnings, energy signatures spiked beyond measurable levels. Space itself seemed to bend around the human ship, the stars behind it warping, shifting, as if reality itself struggled to contain whatever was waking inside. Something was wrong, something was. Then the screaming started, not from his crew, from the ship, the Dominion's flagship. His own vessel screamed, metal groaned, hull plating shuddered as if it were alive, writhing beneath unseen pressure. Warning sirens blared across the bridge, but no one moved, no one could, because they felt that something was reaching inside the ship, not a weapon, not a force, something worse. Cale's vision blurred, his head pounded, his senses fracturing under the weight of something pressing against his mind. He heard whispers, no thoughts, not his own memories, not his. A battlefield, a trench, cold, wet, mud clinging to skin. Explosions overhead, a man screaming in pain, holding his guts inside his stomach as artillery fire ripped through the sky. Another image, darkness, a ruined city, a starving child gnawing on something unthinkable just to stay alive. 1,000 moments of survival, 1,000 horrors endured, and then a singular unified thought that echoed through it all. We survive no matter the cost. Cale gasped as he was released, stumbling back. His vision cleared, but the weight of what he had felt remained pressing against the edges of his mind. Vance watched him now. You understand. Cale's breaths came fast and uneven. His officers were shaking. One had collapsed, her eyes wide with terror. Vance didn't move, didn't blink. We weren't always this, she said. But the universe is cruel. It forces change. We don't have the strongest ships, we don't have the greatest numbers, we never did. The Wraith shifted its form, distorting for the briefest moment, as if what they were seeing was merely a fraction of what truly existed beneath. Vance's voice was barely above a whisper. But we learned how to win. Kale couldn't speak. The Dominion had faced countless enemies, they had won every war, but this was not a war they could win because they had not invaded a planet, they had awoken something else. Entirely. Vance exhaled slowly as if giving them time to let the realization sink in. This is your only chance, Commander. Kale stared at her. Vance's gaze sharpened. Run. The transmission cut. The Wraith did not fire again, did not move to erase them, it simply watched, and Kale did the only thing left to do: full retreat. He whispered. No one argued, no one hesitated. The remaining ships turned and fled, leaving the ruined remnants of their fleet behind. As they jumped to FTL, Kale cast one last look at the Wraith had remained there unmoving, waiting, and for the first time in Dominion history they ran. The Dominion fleet fled like wounded beasts, their once proud warships limping into the void, engines burning hot as they pushed beyond their limits. Some of the vessels sparked and sputtered, their hulls scorched, systems failing, others simply vanished into hyperspace, their commanders too terrified to even check their bearings. Before making the jump, Supreme Commander Kale sat in silence aboard his battered flagship, hands gripping the armrests of his command chair so tightly that his claws had punctured. Moment for you, Vance said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something deeper. Coming to terms with the fact that you were never the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Kale swallowed, his throat dry. Vance continued. The Dominion has spent centuries crushing others. You saw yourselves as untouchable, invincible, but the truth is. She exhaled slowly. You were never alone in the dark. Silence filled the bridge. The Dominion officers stared at the screen, waiting, dreading. We let you believe you were the apex predator, Vance said, because you were never worth the fight. A chill swept through Kale's body. Vance's gaze sharpened. Until now. The words settled like a weight in the room, heavy and final. Vance leaned slightly forward. This is how it's going to be. You're going to return to your people. You're going to lie. You'll tell them whatever you need to tell them. See you fought something unknown, say you lost to a superior force beyond comprehension, but you will not speak of Earth. Kale's jaw clenched. You will not return. Vance's voice was flat, absolute. You will not send scouts. You will not attempt revenge if a single Dominion vessel so much as scans Sol's borders again. The Wraith pulsed for the briefest moment. The stars behind it shuddered. The fabric of space itself bent as if recoiling from whatever the ship truly was. Vance didn't smile, didn't threaten. She simply promised, if you come back, she said softly, you won't get to run next time. Kale's breathing was ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears. Vance tilted her head slightly as if studying him. You still don't understand, do you? The Dominion commander forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse. But what are you? Vance's gaze never wavered. The last survivors, she said. The ones who adapted, the ones who never broke, the ones who learned that the only way to win is to be something that can't lose. Her words hung in the air, a cold truth that settled deep in Kale's chest. Then the transmission cut, and the Wraith vanished, not with a jump, not with a flash of light. It simply ceased to exist, as if it had never been there at all. A hollow silence filled the Dominion flagship. No one moved, no one spoke. Kale exhaled shakily and turned to his officers. His voice was barely a whisper. We are never coming back here. The crew nodded, some too afraid to even meet his eyes, without another word. The Dominion ships disappeared into the void, leaving behind only wreckage, silence, and the lingering knowledge that something far worse than them existed in the universe, and it had just let them live. For now, the journey back to Dominion space was silent. No one spoke, no one dared. The remnants of the once mighty fleet limped through hyperspace, their hulls battered, their crews broken. These were not warriors returning home in triumph, these were survivors. And survivors did not celebrate. Supreme Commander Kale sat in his quarters, staring at the holographic star map flickering before him. His hands trembled slightly, the first physical sign of weakness he had ever allowed himself. He clenched his fists, trying to steady them. It didn't help. His mind was still trapped in the moment, when the Wraith had looked at them, not in the way an enemy does in war, not even in the way a conqueror looks at the conquered. No, the ship, no, the thing had observed them the way a predator watches an animal that wandered too close to the edge of the forest. A simple warning, leave now, and they had the door to his quarters hissed open. Kale didn't need to look up to know who it was. His second-in-command, Commander Furlan, stepped forward, his movements slow and hesitant. That was new. Furlan had always been the most ruthless among his officers, a man who had relished every war, every conquest. Now he looked smaller. We are 2 hours from the High Council's chambers, Furlan said, his voice quiet. Kale exhaled slowly. Furlan hesitated. They will demand an explanation. Of course they would. The Dominion had never suffered a defeat like this before, never had an entire invasion force been shattered without even wounding the enemy. The High Council would demand to know why. They would demand answers. They would demand retribution. Kale closed his eyes. We tell them nothing of Earth. Forlan shifted uncomfortably. Commander, do you really believe we can hide this? Kale opened his eyes, his gaze sharp. We must. Forlan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. They will demand we return a fleet 10 times the size. We are not going back. Kale's voice was steel. A pause, then softer. You felt it too, didn't you? Forlan said nothing. He didn't have to. The memories, the visions, that impossible force pressing against their minds. Every single officer who had been on the bridge, who had seen the race's true nature, had felt it. The truth. They had not encountered advanced technology. They had encountered a warning. Kale leaned forward, his voice lowering to a whisper. We tell them we were defeated by something beyond our understanding. We tell them we barely escaped. We tell them to never return. Forlan hesitated. And if they do not listen? Kale's fingers tapped against the table. Then the Dominion will burn. Forlan's jaw tightened. We should have never gone there. Kale let out a slow, shuddering breath. No, we shouldn't have. A silence settled between them. Then the ship shuddered as they exited hyperspace. They had arrived. The High Council's chamber was a towering hall of obsidian and gold, built to remind all who stood within it of the Dominion's absolute power. The council members sat in a raised semicircle, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks of polished black steel. Only their glowing eyes, burning reds, blues, and violets, were visible beneath the metal. Kale knelt before them, Forlan at his side. A voice boomed from above. Supreme Commander Kale, you stand before this council in disgrace. The words hit like a physical blow. Disgrace. No Dominion commander had ever heard such a word spoken to them before. Kale lifted his head slightly. You lost an invasion force of thousands. Another counselor interrupted, his voice laced with fury. An armada strong enough to conquer an entire sector. Destroyed before even reaching the enemy homeworld. We must return. Another voice snarled. Send a fleet of 5,000, 10,000, wipe these insects from existence. Kale closed his eyes. They didn't understand. They couldn't. The Dominion had always believed strength was the answer. If they lost a battle, they sent a larger force. If they faced resistance, they crushed it without mercy. But this was different. This was not a war they could win. This enemy is beyond us, Kale said finally. The chamber fell silent. Then laughter, low, cold, mocking. A counselor leaned forward, his glowing violet eyes narrowing. Beyond us. Another scoffed. The Supreme Commander of the Dominion speaks as if he is afraid. Kale's claws dug into his palms. I am afraid. The laughter stopped. Silence, uncomfortable, heavy. Never before had an admiral of the Dominion admitted fear. One of the counselors leaned forward. Explain. Kale exhaled. We did not lose to superior numbers. We did not lose to stronger weapons. We lost because the enemy is not like us. A murmur spread through the chamber. They do not fight as we do, Kale continued. They do not think as we do. They are something else. He hesitated, then he spoke the words that had been haunting him since the moment they had fled. We have never fought a true predator before. A pause. The counselors studied him, their glowing eyes unblinking. Finally one of them spoke. You expect us to believe that one human warship defeated the greatest armada the Dominion has ever assembled? Kale's eyes darkened. It wasn't a warship. That made them pause. Then what was it? Kale's voice was barely above a whisper. A message. A long silence filled the chamber. The counselors exchanged glances. Even they, in all their arrogance, could sense that something was deeply wrong. Finally one of them leaned forward. Then we will not return. It was not a question, it was a decree. The decision was made. No Dominion ship would ever set course for Sol again. They would not challenge humanity. Not because of diplomacy, not because of fear of war, but because for the first time in Dominion history they had found something that could end them forever. The decision was made. The Dominion would never return, but Kale knew it wasn't over. Even as the High Council decreed that Sol would remain untouched, he could see the unease in their eyes. They did not understand what had happened. They only knew fear, and fear had a way of fading with time. He had seen it before. Wars forgotten, warnings ignored. The Dominion was a machine of conquest. It was only a matter of time before their hunger overpowered their. Ralk exhaled slowly, his hands trembling as they hovered over the console. The High Council would demand a report. The shadow rulers of the Dominion would want to know what happened, but what could he tell them? That they had looked into the abyss, and that the abyss had smiled. He clenched his fists. No, they would never understand. The Dominion had spent centuries believing they were the apex of the galaxy, the ultimate force of nature. They had ruled through strength, through fear, through conquest, but humanity did not conquer, humanity did not rule, humanity simply was, and the universe bent around them. Ralph took a slow, shuddering breath. He knew what he had to do. When the observer finally re-entered Dominion space, he would not deliver the report they expected. He would erase everything, every scan, every recording, every trace of what had happened at Sol. He would delete the logs, he would silence the crew, and then he would disappear. Because the greatest mercy he could grant the Dominion was ignorance. If they ever returned, if they ever tried to understand, they would not survive. The answer: the Dominion never spoke of Earth again, not in their archives, not in their war councils, not in the whispers of their spies, as if Sol had never existed, as if humanity had never existed, as if somewhere deep in the void a truth too terrible to name waited in silence, patient and unchallenged, a truth that had been ignored, a truth that had been forgotten, and a truth that, for the sake of all things, must never be remembered.